Professor Casanova is now senior fellow of the Berkeley Center in Georgetown University. And of course, is well known around the world, a former professor at the New School for Social Research in New York, and later, of course, at Georgetown University in Washington. He has written a lot about public religion in an explicit and circumstantial manner. His thesis is, as you know, that the response of historical religions to the individualization of the religious fact lies in the recovery of their public function. This represents a clear request to the state to criticize its value and ethical neutrality. In short, religions seem to have re-entered the public debate in Spain and in Poland, and in Iran, in Latin America, as in the United States. What is more, religions have contributed to exacerbating certain conflicts in the Balkans and beyond the Iron Curtain in the former Soviet countries. But even in the countries most characterized by Western culture, the revival of religions is evident and challenges established positions, both politically and economically. Casanova contributed significantly to demolishing the myth of secularization and highlighting the existence of broad processes of desecularization, pointing out the reemergence of forms of the sacred, which had never actually disappeared. Secularization is also seen as a process of differentiation, which should have led to a clear distinction between churches and states. But this did not happen. Furthermore, a peculiar character of secularization was considered to be the decline in religious practice, which, however, did not go beyond certain limits and boundaries of specific contexts. Privatization was also considered a constant of secularization, imagining that there was a refuge in private religiosity as a result of a rejection of a public and institutional religiosity. But even in this case, the predictions turned out to be misleading and unfounded. In fact, there was no possibility of verification of what had been predicted. Now, religions continue to survive, and they survived the COVID too. Casanova does not deny religious structures the right to act in public within the scope of possible freedoms. Above all, it comes to terms with the communitarian dimension of some churches, the Catholic Church in primis. From this, it derives the conviction that a community cannot be autonomous, allowing for an individualistic, privatistic retreat of religiosity. On the contrary, it is easier to observe an orientation in the opposite direction, that is, aim at the deprivatization of the religious fact. The new fact would be represented for Casanova by the choice of religions not to interfere in the affairs of the state, but to prefer the public space of civil society where they could seek synergies of values with others. Nevertheless, Casanova himself recognizes that Western European societies have a higher level of secularization than other countries. At the same time, however, he sees a growing interest of religions in social issues and also notes the intermingling of religious faith and nationalism, especially in certain areas. Ultimately, there would be a repoliticization of religion in another guise. This would be the ultimate historical precipitate after the beginnings of the secularizing current, to be traced back to the soteriological perspective with its redeeming character, inherent in the face of the Protestant Reformation and in some of the very premises of the Enlightenment. This would give rise to the sociological ideas that were developed by the theories of secularization, as already mentioned. Religious decline, especially at the level of practice, differentiation of the religious from the secular, privatization and marginalization of religion. In fact, only differentiation would have an empirical confirmation in reality. To conclude, Casanova goes so far as to argue that public and repoliticized religion is a critical response to modernity and the Enlightenment. In fact, it is capable not so much of opposing Enlightenment rationality as of introducing intersubjective norms into the private sphere and an ethic of the public good into the state and the economy. In Spain and Poland, Catholicism have favored the transition to the democratic system. In Brazil, liberation theology has seen the church in defense of human rights, and in the United States, the Christian religions have intervened on these issues. Finally, for Casanova, secularization and sacralization can go hand in hand, and the former certainly does not depend on modernization. Otherwise, there would be no explanation for the differences between Europe, which is more secularized, and the United States, which has more religious connotations. Neither the idea of exceptionalism applied to the European case, nor that of rational choice applied to the American religious market are therefore convincing. While in Europe, the belief in and importance of religion have disappeared, in the United States, on the other hand, at least belief has not seen any break with the past. This is just to present in a few words José Casanova work. Now, let me say something about Cenap Aydin. He has a degree in political science and in sociology at Istanbul University in Turkey. He studied Catholic theology and church history at Gregorian University in Rome. And first of all, is co-founder and coordinator of the Tevere Institute, Istituto Tevere, for the intercultural dialogue. He is a very activist, scholar, public speaker, and today he has to manage the dialogue with José Casanova. Cenap, to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cipriani.
Can you increase your volume a little bit?
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Not so much.
Really? Okay, wow.
I can hear you well.
Okay, just let me try a little bit like that. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And just let me tell you at the beginning, I just remembered our meeting again in March 2015. We were all together, Professor Casanova, Professor Cipriani, me, and the Istituto Tevere, and just I could not believe that 6 years passed, really, this tempus fugit, and now we are here online. I will be very just happy, you know, just to join you today and for this meeting. And actually, as you have already seen, today we will be talking about religions in the time of COVID-19, Professor Casanova, and I will try to ask some questions, but just they are not real the questions, but maybe just to facilitate the conversation, because we are so honored and happy to be with Professor Casanova, who is the great expert, as Professor Cipriani already taught. Just to get prepared for this meeting, I got back to my college years. I was studying sociology in the last years of the last millennium and last century. And just after the publication of this great book, and I just got back to this book and then just rereading and then just remembering, you know, just how I was excited and find it very enthusiastic. Just, you know, also being in Istanbul, in a city which is usually a workshop to study religions and the relation between religion, politics, secularization in particular. And just I would like to now just start with my first question to facilitate our conversation today. And again, thanking Professor Casanova for joining us. And starting with the book, of course. This book is published in 1994, Public Religions in the Modern World, but it did not only just, influence the sociology of religion, but also in different areas of social sciences in which scholars and colleagues are studying and the role of religion in the public life, in the public sphere. And we would like to start again remembering, the basic thesis of this book with Professor Casanova, and especially focusing on the relation between modernization and secularization, given his deep knowledge and experience in both continental American contexts. Usually, scholars are focusing on each of them, but given his personal history, being from Spain, studied first in Austria, in Innsbruck, then in New School for Social Research, I would say the most continental university in America, in the United States. So, and as we know very well, Hannah Arendt, was over there. Hannah Arendt was a scholar over there. So the first question would be to have this theoretical background before we discuss the role of religions in the era of COVID-19. Floor is yours, Professor Casanova.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Roberto, caro Roberto, grazie mille per la gentile introduzione. I would prefer to speak Italian. Unfortunately, my Italian is not good enough. I can, however, remind the Italian speakers that the book was actually translated into Italian. It's Oltre la secolarizzazione and was published by Il Molino. So if you are interested, you can also read the text in Italian. Professor Cipriani already has given a very good background and summary of the thesis. Let me simply autobiographically say that, of course, I studied theology in Innsbruck from 1969-73. These were the very, very, if you wish, interesting years after Vatican II. But also it was the years when in Europe, everybody took for granted secularization. Theologians were speaking of the death of God. So I accepted the thesis of secularization because all the theologians had accepted it. But then I came to the United States and I realized something was not right. The most religious, the most modern country in the world was also one of the most religious. So something with the thesis that the more modern society, the more secular it will be, something did not work well. So the book is, on the one hand, the result of coming to terms with this reality. And the big probably discovery for me was to realize that American religion, evangelical religion, was not a survival, a traditional survival from the past that eventually will go away, but was a product of American modernity. And so the whole notion that religion is tradition and there is no room for religion in the modern world didn't work. Because if American religion was a product of modernity, the same could be said about Hindu religion and the revival of Islam today. Those are not traditional residues. Those are really transformations of all religions in modern conditions. The next point was the experience of 1979, when you have simultaneously these four world-shattering events, world historical shattering events. The election of the Polish Pope that led to solidarity and the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the emergence of the religious right in the United States in the electoral politics when Ronald Reagan became president, it was 79, and since then, politics in the United States has never been the same. And the same thing can be said about Islam in the whole world, has changed dramatically after the Islamic Revolution. And then the Nicaraguan Revolution that was basically an outcome of the long-term process of transformation of Latin American Catholicism under what we know as liberation theology. So something dramatically was being transformed in the modern world, in the global modern world, because this was not This was in the three worlds of development. In the United States, the first world, in Poland, in the Soviet Union, the second world of development, but also in the third world of development, Nicaragua, Iran. So the whole world was being transformed. And it was very clear that the notion that religion was going to disappear was not happening, but also the notion that religion ought to be a private affair was not happening, and it was perhaps good that it was not happening, namely that religion, because one possibility would be to understand those processes as religious fundamentalism against the modern world, against secularity. But I want to argue these are not anti-modern movements per se. These are not anti-secular movements. Those are attempts of religion to play a role, an active role, in the transformation of the modern world. So it was, and that's why I call it the deprivatization of religion. Religion was not accepting this role that both the modern liberal political theories were given them, democratic societies that were saying religion ought to be a private affair, but also the social sciences were predicting. So it was not only that religion was not accepting this role, but perhaps, as we saw in transformation in Poland, it actually could work for democracy. So it could work for what we will consider positive modern processes. But this happens, I argue, particularly with respect to the Catholic Church, if the Catholic Church accepted this establishment and, however, wanted to be a public religion in the public sphere of civil society. Now, I wouldn't say that all religions need to have this restriction, because if they are Republican religions, let's say, I wouldn't call the black churches that they should not get organized in the United States politically, but it's different. It is in the context of a hegemonic church like the Catholic Church that was basically established throughout the Catholic world, that this transformation is necessary. And perhaps for some other religions, for Islam, may be necessary. But the question was that we should think of secularization as a much more complex processes that may go in different directions. On the one hand, you had differentiation of the religious and secular spheres that function et si Deus non daretur, as if God would not exist. That's what it means, secular spheres. It's not that people in those spheres may not be believers. Scientists, even Nobel Prize scientists, may be believers, but science, modern science, functions as if God would not exist. The hypothesis of God does not enter into scientific explanations. The same you could say about modern politics. That's what Hugo Grotius, that basically coined the term et si Deus non daretur, meant for international law, precisely because each of the different countries of the Westphalian system follow different confessions. You had to have an international law above the confessions that was not following neither Catholics nor Protestants, and therefore should function et si Deus non daretur, as if God would not exist. The same you could say about markets. People dealing with markets, money, they may be believers or are not. By markets function as if God would not exist. So those spheres have become what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame of our modern societies. But then, what happens within those societies? Which roles do we religious groups, religious communities, religious institutions accept is open-ended. They can become privatized, or they become basically bring their own values, their own norms into public debate, the way in which in democratic societies, everything is debated in the public toward the transformation of the common good.
Thank you, sir, very much. I mean, yeah, that's just really, I mean, it was very eye-opening, because just we really needed to, to focus on, just on this perspective that you have developed, starting with your book, but also in your work for the upcoming decades. And this work, of course, has been so much appreciated and discussed worldwide for this last 3 decades. And as a result of several academic exchanges, as we all, and with great scholars around the world, and I remember immediately Charles Taylor, but also Craig Calhoun, Mark Juggensmeyer, and others. And you have assessed, and I would say focus on three concepts, very basic concepts. The concept that the secularizations, with plural, again, secularism is plural. And in your article in a book called Rethinking Secularism and others in other places too, could you elaborate more on these concepts again, if and possible also with new emerging cases around the world? Now we are discussing the new French bill in France, the new French bill in France about laïcité, and then now they began India, Hungary, Turkey, and that will be actually the second step in our conversation.
Okay. Well, again, secularization was the concept everybody used. Secularization refers to truly historical processes of transformation of European societies, which means the differentiation of secular spheres from religion. And this is a fundamental modern process. The fact that these secular spheres emerge and that religion becomes also itself a differentiated sphere. So we should refer secularization particularly to these historical processes. Whether there is decline of religion or not is open-ended. The secular is a concept that it was precisely Talal Asad that raised the issue. We have spent the last 200 years trying to develop an anthropology, a sociology of religion, but nobody has tried to begin to form an anthropology of the secular, a sociology of the secular. And we know that the secular is a fundamental modern category, the other of religion. But what does it consist in? And this reminds me of a famous joke in Northern Ireland, somebody going from a Catholic to a Protestant neighborhood and being detained by somebody with a gun. Hands up, what are you, Protestant or Catholic? No, I'm an atheist, but which one? A Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Yeah, I'm secular, but which one? A Catholic secular, Protestant secular, Muslim secular. Remember, if the secular is the other of religion, then the secular will be shaped, will be informed by the religion that is left behind. So we need to develop really a new scholarship on the secular both in terms of sensibilities, in terms of anthropologies of the secular, in terms of different ways of being secular. And there is now in the last 10 years, some of the precisely most interesting research in the sphere of what was before the sociology of religion is precisely in the sphere of non-belief. What are the beliefs of non-believers? The sphere of secularity. And then secularism. Secularism is an ism that has two dimensions. One, the ideological one, because secularization implies a teleology that the more modern, the less religious. But it implied also a genealogical theory of religion that said religion is something very primitive, non-rational, that will disappear with modernity. And so the contemporary transformation of religion challenges both the telos, but also the genesis, the explanation of religion as something very traditional, very primitive that will disappear. So secularism is an ideology of what religion is and will be. And one could say that the reason why European societies are so secularized is because they accepted the genealogical critique of religion that was developed by the European Enlightenment. Precisely that religion has this ground in something non-rational, irrational, that will disappear with the advancement of rationality. And this, of course, is being challenged today within philosophy, within history, etc. The other aspect, however, secularism is a statecraft. The fact that precisely there is a secularism, the one of laïcité, which means a state that wants to put religion in its place, that want to restrain the role of religion in the public sphere. This is the French laïcité. But it's another type of state secularism, which actually is not so much to restrain religion, but precisely given the conditions of religious pluralism, which are unavoidable in the modern world. You need a state that remains relatively neutral vis-a-vis all religions, that doesn't privilege one religion over others, maintains a certain distance from all of them, but also protects their functioning in civil society, their pluralism. So state secularism for the sake of the management of diversity and religious pluralism fairly. And this is the secularism that is emerging almost as a global need. The more precisely it's clear that the whole world is becoming increasingly more religiously diverse and plural, we will need states which maintain a neutrality that doesn't privilege, but also do not disprivilege any religion, that protects religious freedom of groups and individuals, and also helps manage their diversity in a peaceful context, in a, if you wish, helpful competition. In this respect, there are multiple secularisms. I mentioned the French laïcité and American secularism, two very different models. We know that Turkish secularism was copied from the French secularism. Laïc was even the concept. You adopted in Turkey, you adopted the concept of laïc. But of course, under Ataturk, the Turkish state was secular, but also managed a state religion. As you know, the Ministry of Religious Affairs was the largest ministry in the Turkish state because it really controls, it has made of Sunni Islam a state Islam. And in the process, of course, then you have the reemergence of Islamism that may, in the context now, use already disestablished state secularism to precisely bring religion more into the public sphere, but also into the sphere of the state. Indian secularism was closer to the American model. It was precisely the tragedy of precisely the separation of Pakistan as an Islamic country, both Bangladesh, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and the terrible genocides that happened on both sides. Nehru and the others, Ambedkar, the great Buddhist, the father of the Indian Constitution, to recognize that it was necessary to create a structure in which precisely all religions were protected, all the minorities, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Sikh, were protected from Hindu majoritarian religion. But as we know politically today, there is the emergence of a Hindu nationalism that wants to get rid of this state secularism to create a majoritarian secularism. Namely, yes, secularism to protect Hindu religion and to, if you wish, reform minority religions. So again, the question is, which kind of secularisms everywhere are we talking about? Secularisms to protect religious freedom, to protect religious diversity, or secularisms to restrain religion, to put it in its place, a kind of private place where religions ought to remain without entering the public sphere. So this is our open questions. Today, what we need is the comparative studies of secularizations, how it happened in very different areas of the world, in different religious traditions. Comparative studies of the secular. You could say the Chinese secular was always very different from the Christian secular. You could say that Confucianism is already a form of proto-secularity. And so you need to understand the historical traditions that were already part of these civilizations in distinguishing the sacred and the non-sacred, the profane, and then how the religious secular modern division is superimposed upon already divisions of the sacred and the profane to create new dynamics. And this we need truly a comparative historical analysis of secularizations, of the secular, and of secularisms. Because there are multiple secularizations in the plural, multiple seculars in the plural, and multiple secularisms in the plural.
Thank you very much. For this, I will say that was a more or less the first part that we, just revisited with you again the theoretical background, and especially at the end, and just you reminded us, especially, you know, your basic approach, the comparative historical sociological approach, which puts together just different experiences in a historical perspective. And now I would like to focus more on, you know, the role of religion or religions and the era of COVID-19, especially with the reference to the Catholic Church. You have been studying Catholic Church for the decades, and especially in this period of a pandemic, the Catholic Church has become a focus of attention in the international public sphere, especially with these powerful images of Pope Francis praying alone in the St. Peter's Square and elsewhere. And just within this, I mean, given this context and the concept that you are frequently using, all these radical changes happened in the Catholic Church in the 20th century, aggiornamento, and starting with the Pope John 23rd, Papa Roncalli. And how would you see now the role of Catholic Church in terms of interfaith and ecumenical relations in this post-pandemic era? Because, and I would like to just also add, you have mentioned Tal al-Assad, and I know that you are also organizing seminars about Judaism, Christian Islam with Tal al-Assad and the New School for Social Research. So you have also this direct involvement and academically with the interfaith the studies, and that will be, you know, the start. How can we just approach the role of religion in period of COVID-19, especially starting with the role of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis other religions and Christian confessions?
This is a very broad question. We must distinguish two aspects. One, the question of how different religious communities responded to the pandemic, to the crisis of the pandemic. How did they adjust it? Like everybody had to adjust to these conditions. And here one can use the old sociological distinction, sociological, between church and sect, which is not a theological distinction, but a sociological one. Churches are those religions which are basically in relatively dialogue with the world out there. They are not in fundamental tension, but they work together with the world. And in this respect, those religions that were in good terms with the world, they simply accepted the public health directives. So if the public health says there should be no meetings, then those religious communities adapted and also restricted their communal meetings because they realized that they could be the carriers of the pandemic. So that's why you could see the Pope praying alone in Peter's Square, giving the sign that we also, the most powerful church in the world, should accept these public health directives. But for instance, to give you an example, the Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia, accepted the directives of the public authorities and functioned the way every other institution in Russia functioned. But the same Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, was in conflict with Ukrainian nation state and therefore refused to close their churches and continue meeting during the pandemic. So here you have precisely because the same church functions as a church in Russia, but as a sect in Ukraine, it also acted differently vis-a-vis public health directives. The more important question, of course, how has this affected? After all, religions are communitarian experiences. They have to function in community. That's why the notions of a private religion cannot really, would mean the end of religion if it had to be privatized into a purely individual belief and in the individual conscience. It needs communitarian dimensions where people can celebrate whatever is sacred for them together. The celebration, the rituals are as important for religious communities as the beliefs. Without rituals, there are no religious communities. So the question is, how have they adapted? And we see that they've adapted the way We all have adapted. You could also say that there can be no academic progress without meetings, without discussions, but we've adapted. The purely discursive, the purely, if you wish, more logical aspect of relations can be done online. But the ritual aspects, the celebration together, this needs to be done. And that's why we celebrate, even in a more exacerbated form, with a greater happiness, when we can get together with family, with friends, even with colleagues. And so, yes, the question is, how are the religious communities being transformed and will be transformed by the experience of the pandemic? And here, concerning the Catholic Church and interfaith, interecumenical dialogue, obviously, if they cannot get together, their own community, they cannot get together with the others. But once they get together, interfaith could continue, as we know, precisely as a communication. This is really sort of, I mean, for me, as a student of Catholicism, the way in which the Catholic Church, from being the religion that insisted on being the true religion and the others not being true religions, to becoming the global leader in interfaith, inter-ecumenical dialogue is really, really extraordinary. And of course, you mentioned Papa Roncalli, but obviously all the other popes have continued this interfaith, inter-ecumenical dialogue, whether with Orthodoxy, with Judaism, with Islam. And obviously it goes back to Nostra Aetate, our age. The recognition of Vatican II that our global age is an age of religious pluralism. And that is a crucial sign of the times. It's not only that it's a fact, but it's a sign of the times for the Catholic Church to recognize this religious pluralism as the condition of our global human family. And therefore the need to enter into dialogue with all religious traditions. And this, I think, what obviously John Paul II did it with Assisi, and Comunitas San Egidio has continued the interfaith meetings, prayers in Assisi. And certainly this Pope has done it everywhere, going everywhere into the world, when in Sri Lanka, in Korea, and of course going to meet with the leaders of Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam, precisely to make this point very clear, that the religious communities need to work together for the global common good, for the good of global humanity, of the human family. Because I think this is the fundamental learning of the pandemic. Already, Pope Francis had already mentioned it before. There are fundamental global challenges we are facing as global humanity. Those are, of course, the immigration crisis, the environmental crisis, the crisis of global inequality, so immigration, refugees, global inequality, and now the pandemic, the global health crisis. And what the pandemic has shown, especially the response, is that those are global challenges that neither the world capitalist system, let's call Davos, nor the world international system of nation states cannot really address. And we need a different type of response coming from global civil society that takes the common good, not the national interest and not the interest of capitalism, but the global common good. And it is in strengthening a global civil society, the transnational religions, I would say most necessarily the Catholic Church, but also Islam and all the other transnational religions, have a unique challenge and a role to play. Not alone, because there are many other secular transnational groups, from Doctors Without Borders to all immigration and refugees NGOs and environmental NGOs and feminist NGOs. All of those are part of the need to work together, religious groups, secular groups, for the global common good. And this is why religions, because neither states are going to do that, nor global capitalism is going to do that. We need a strengthening of global civil society, and religions have unique role to play in this respect.
Thank you so much. And yeah, just you have reminded us again this Copernican revolution with Nostra Aetate and also Dignitatis Humanae, and both declarations actually, and the change, I would say also the history of humanity, how the Catholic Church also just, changed and her approach towards other religions, and then open up different ways of not only dialogue, but also collaboration and working together. And the last part of your response, you were mentioning transnational movements, especially transnational religious movements, and those who are familiar with your work, and you are also working in this area and analyzing them and comparing them, especially transnational religious movement, and putting them from different religious traditions, putting them into a common perspective. And in this world, in a world, religious services and practices and religious socialization become more and more online, especially after the pandemic. And how do you see the relation between the local, I would say, religiöse Gemeinschaften, religious communities, and this transnational, global religiöse Gemeinschaften, where the national and transnational boundaries are redefined constantly, and in which nation state is challenged, but in a way with the pandemic remembered again? And how would you see this dynamic between the local communities and their references at transnational level?
I think we have to think of deterritorialized communities. We thought of churches, as Max Weber defined, as a territorial institution that has the monopoly of the means of grace over a territory, like the state. And the parish, the religious community of the parish, was the territory at the local level. What modernity forces all religions to become deterritorialized. Deterritorialized from the nation state, deterritorialized from the parish, and become voluntary religious communities. Not necessarily precisely individualistic, voluntary. But look at Italy. Italy has given some of the most interesting religious communities in the last 50 years. Think of Comunitas San Egidio. Think of Focolare. Think of Comunione and Liberazione. All those are not anymore based on territorial communities, but rather are religious communities that come together to open up themselves to enter in communication with others, particularly in the case of Focolare, searching unity with everybody, with believers and non-believers, and of course, San Egidio, especially to help the poor, to enter to those in the periphery, to help peacemaking. Now, this is a symbol. For me, those are the symbols of the type of religious communities that need to be reconstituted everywhere. And of course, they began as Italian communities, but now they are transnational communities all over the world. All three of them have become global communities. The same we could say about Islam, the way in which different Muslim groups, whether Tablighi or any type of even your own community of the Instituto Tevere, and different communities within Islam that have emerged, and they've become transnational religious communities, linking the diasporas of all the world religion, but also entering in communications with other religions because they are not anymore the territorial monopoly. And therefore, they are much more open to communicate with others because they do not have a sense of ownership of a territory. So I think, yes, the task is, the fundamental problem is, I always thought the sociology of the city, urban sociology, was convinced that urbanization leads to secularization because they saw that in Europe, religion disappears in the big cities. Disappears because the parish community cannot be reconstituted. It has to be reconstituted as a voluntary community. But this is what Tocqueville already saw in America, that in all American towns, you have many, many competing religious communities with one another. So you lose the monopoly, but you have the possibility of religious communities emerging everywhere. And this we see in global cities. Global cities today are based on a tremendous form of religious pluralism, diasporas, new religious communities that emerge. So the question is how the pandemic, on the one hand, obviously limits the possibility for the religious communities to meet face to face. but it gives them also means to communicate with their brothers and sisters all over the world. So the pandemic has both restraints, but also possibilities that before we did not even consider. So how to link the local religious communities to the transnational global religious communities, what I call the global ummas or global denominations. This, of course, a task for all religious communities. In the case of the papacy, in the case of precisely Catholic Church, this is the role of the papacy, to serve as the symbol that unified all the different types of religious communities despite their diversity. And so every global ummah will have to find ways of maintaining both local diversity while being linked to their global community. This is an open task for all the religious communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much for also the examples, and I'm also trying to study the cases of Focolare movement and the Comunità Sant'Egidio from this perspective. That's why I really appreciated these examples. My next question will be again about religious communities. And these religious communities around the world have also responded theologically to the pandemic. And considering these responses and their varieties among each other, we know just all eschatological responses and just ranging from God's curse to another level. And does the COVID-19 era could lead to, again, tonight, just we referred to Durkheim, we referred to several times Weber, but I will just go back to the Weberian term, Entzauberung, disenchantment, and just turning it down. Could this responses lead to a Wiederverzauberung, re-enchantment of word, at least for some religious communities who have been challenged by secularization recently?
Although I am a Weberian methodologically in terms of being a comparative historical sociologist, I always thought that the thesis of disenchantment was one of the weakest link of Max Weber's theory. And this has been shown systematically in the work of Hans Joas, The Power of the Sacred. What happens not the linear theory of disenchantment from primitive religion to modern secularity, but actually constant historical process of re-sacralization, desacralization. So religions in the axial age emerged to desacralize nature, to desacralize sacred kings, and to resacralize the transcendent divinity. And then, of course, you have modernity sacralizes the secular spheres of the state, of the economy, of science, and religions precisely have a function there, desacralizing those spheres, not for the sake of a resacralization of themselves, but for what we could call the resacralization of humanity and of our common home. One of the fundamental theological aspects of globalization is the recognition that we are one single global human family and that we have one single home, and that this forces us to take this fact very seriously, how we are linked together with this earth in the cosmos. And this is a fundamental theological question. So obviously, religions may respond to this by going against the secular world and saying this is the problem, and trying to fight against secularism, against all kinds of modern processes. This is, of course, you could say an apocalyptic, eschatological solution or response. The other is, however, the recognition that we are in this together and that we have a special responsibility as religions to work together for the common good. And in this respect, one of the fundamental tasks, we need to resacralize. We need to sacralize humanity, the sacred dignity of the human person, each individual. And to a certain extent, human rights is a form of sacralizing humanity. But of course, sacralizing not juridification, because then people respond. We have to find a way of doing it without the states taking over the process, because they basically make it more complex. And then you will have responses that is a Western imposition, etc. So how to maintain the universality of humanity while precisely accepting the fundamental diversity of humanity? This is the task of universalism, particularism. how to be both universal and particular, and how to recognize the particularisms that need to be accepted, those which may need to be questioned. And the other is need to resacralize the earth, the cosmos, precisely because science can tell us what to do, what needs to be done, but doesn't move us to do it. Science help us recognize the question, the problem, but to move us to do something, we need some ethical dimension, some moral dimension, and these religions can do. So we need to bring, not resacralize in the way in which nature was sacralized before differentiation, but to take nature with new reverence, with a critical, sacred reverence. So a critical reflexivity vis-a-vis our living home, because this is our life world. It's not anymore dead nature out there to be exploited, to be instrumentally used, but it's part of our life world that we need to continue living as a global community. So this is the fundamental, I would argue, the fundamental task of a challenge, right? So religions can respond apocalyptically by rejecting everything modern, everything secular, and basically hoping a kind of end of the world kind of solution, or can take the responsibility of contributing to the work of sacralizing humanity by sacralizing not individuals, but the human person. So what makes us sacred is not what each of us has as individual, our individual differences, our gender, our wisdom, our wealth. No, it is what we have in common as humans. And the weakest of us represent humanity the most. So it is the possibility of sacralizing the human person, in a way sacralizing human, not individuals. We are not sacred as individuals. Human persons are sacred. And resacralizing our living world, our common home. So if you call this re-enchantment, then I would say, yes, we need, but not enchantment uncritically, because we need to be critical, as supposed to separate sacralization of individuals, of the powerful individuals, from sacralization of our common humanity.
Thank you. I mean, your perspective about the human family and just considering the whole human family related to each other, just remembered again. I remembered the document of Abu Dhabi, the Human Fraternity document, co-written, and it's important to underline because most of the time people don't focus that it's just not only written by and signed by Pope Francis, but co-written by Pope Francis and the Imam of Al-Azhar University, Ahmed Al-Tayyib. But as you have already said, just starting with St. John 23rd and arriving Pope Francis, and also in that document, and also in the new encyclical Fratelli Tutti, I also see so many elements which have been already developed by the magisterium, by different popes. Even here, talking about human person, I would like to also mention Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher, who was actually a staunch defender of the person, human person, as the main category whenever we approach the social phenomenon. And I just arrived to the end of my questions. I have a more general question, but I will leave it at the end. Now I would like to open the floor for our guests. If they would like to pose questions to Professor Casanova, they are so much welcome. And here I see Dagmar Schweck, and then just I give her the floor, and then please.
Yes, thank you so much for all these answers to a lot of questions I was asking myself recently, especially the response to the COVID-19, the religious response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm coming a little bit from a different background. So I'm working on Bhutan, so basically Tibetan Buddhist cultural area, with Bhutan as the only country which kind of is an example of what is sometimes called alternative modernities. And their response to COVID-19 had been so interesting. And when you talked about religious communities or institutions reacting to public policies and following it, and then also the reverse effect, like that what people believe, and these all other also theological dimensions, which could really positively also influence then public policies back, so to speak, because of very unprofessionally said what people believe, right? And how they respond to crisis, or also the climate crisis. And I was with what I'm working on something like an analytical framework for the case of Bhutan. And what I'm struggling with in my work generally is how do we analyze and measure, or also just like what are our analytical categories for this connection back to policies. You know, we have all these ideas of how we differentiate, and when we worked on a specific region or religion, we work with a certain framework, but then there is this positive or sometimes also negative feedback from these religious communities back, and some help or also maybe ideas of how to work further on these last aspects you mentioned, the human family and so forth, in our work on secularisms and so forth. I don't know, that was not too clear, I guess. I'm sorry, but like, yeah.
Well, no, it's, I mean, I don't know enough of Tibetan Buddhism to really enter into the specifics of it. But we know, of course, that in all religious traditions, healing, physical healing, and salvation, spiritual well-being go together. I mean, in Latin, salus is both, right? Health and salvation. And this basically almost in all religious traditions. And particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, the work also of a spiritual healing and physical healing go very much together. So this situation is, if you wish, a challenge to all religious traditions to respond in a positive way, because it's to both, to the dimensions of physical and spiritual healing. And I think that here we must recognize that different religious traditions have different resources that we can use creatively to respond to the challenge. And again, in conditions in which there is no recognized public health, I mean, Bhutan maybe, but let's say Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, where you have a condition in which basically, you know, that the Chinese state is very much, they wanted to take over the whole structure of organization of the community and even going against the tradition, then you'll have a sense in which the tradition will go against the state. And so those are dynamics, or with the Uyghurs in China. So the question again is, what is the relationship between the public health communities and the religious communities? How can they work together for the common good of everybody and of society? And when are they working at cross purposes in a way that doesn't help neither the public authorities nor the religious communities? But again, this is an open question as to how, but we know, for instance, that Tibetan Buddhism is also at the forefront of environmental concerns. It's not only the Catholic Church, the Dalai Lama has taken also the role of very clear a global leader on environmental issues. And the same goes for the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. He also has taken basically a global leadership role on those issues. So I think that it is very important that all these global religious leaders can come together and exchange the kind of experiences and resources and possible responses where they can work together for the common good. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Professor Cipriani, you can just also, whenever you want.
Yes, Professor Casanova, you frequently compare United States or North America in general and Europe. What about the impact of Pope Francis alone in St. Peter's Square to pray God in order to have the end of this pandemic? What is the impact of Pope Francis in the States?
Well, Pope Francis is a polarizing figure in the States because everything is being polarized in the United States today. And the Catholic community in the US is very much divided. You could say because it's all basically viewed through the political prism of Republican and Democrats. It's a pity, but this was the case. When Pope Francis visited the US and spoke in Congress, this was not the case. He was received relatively positively by everybody in Congress at the time. I still remember when this was possible, right? For the Pope to come and speak of American saints, mentioning a few Catholics that had been crucial figures, Merton and what's the name? The founder of the Catholic Worker, and of course Lincoln and Martin Luther King as American saints, right? And then discussing the need to work together in equality and against the death penalty and all kinds of things that he was able to present, and for the US to play another role in selling arms to the whole world. And again, it was relatively positive, the response. Today, this is much more difficult. So because it is all been already viewed through the prism of the position you take on abortion, you know, the position of the Conference of Bishops being torn about whether to actually come with a policy of not denying, excommunicating Catholic politicians because of their view on abortion. I think this is extremely critical to use excommunication under those conditions like that. I mean, you know, we are entering into a game then who excommunicates whom, and we see what happens when Russia excommunicates the ecumenical patriarch, and then what happens is the whole Orthodox community becomes divided in the whole world. So let's stop excommunicating and let's work together in communion with one another. So, but this is difficult. This is difficult, and also, obviously, the US is going through a very serious spiritual crisis precisely because of the role, the way in which religion has been polarized. Young people don't want to take part of it, the nuns, all those people that basically don't want to anything to do with institutional religion. It's not that they are atheists or secularists, but simply none of the above. And it's not that finally Americans are becoming modern, that they were not yet modern, but it is they are responding to the specific role in which religion has been polarized and politicized in the US. And therefore, young people don't want to have anything to do with it, precisely because it has to do with the sacralization of the human person. And here we are fighting the sacralization of the unborn with the sacralization of everybody else. And so we are really fighting battles of sacralization against sacralization. And this, of course, negative for everybody.
Thank you.
Further questions, comments? Would you like to share?
David, please.
Sorry,
no.
Could you again? Okay.
Need to be on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please, David. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Thank you very much for your fine comments. And one question that will not surprise you, because I've done a fair amount of work on this myself, but you have repeatedly used the term the common good in talking about the direction in which we need to move, and the diverse groups should be committed to the common good and not to a narrowly defined private good and so forth. And I completely agree with this. But there has been in modern liberal political thought a great reluctance to say that we could even identify the common good, that we have to be much more defending of individual freedom, because the common good is an idea that is from the past. And I don't agree with that. But I'm interested, in light of your reflections on what's been going on in terms of COVID and the other issues that you've mentioned about environment and refugees and so forth. do you think that religious communities can make a distinctive contribution to helping us discover what the common good really is? And that would be kind of counter to the liberal view that different communities that have different traditions should simply get along together by leaving each other alone. Don't interfere with me. Let me do my. I'm interested in your reflections upon that and where we're going in regard to the common good, especially since you used that phrase so frequently in your comments.
Right. I mean, I have not followed the debates, to be honest with you. I'm less and less enamored of analytical theories of morality. We cannot identify the common good theoretically in the sense that we can identify what it is. It can only be done in practice by overcoming our differences, by joining together. The common good emerges when we overcome our own individual interests and work together with other individual interests, and then the common good emerges out of this experience, out of the practice. So the role of religion is not to preach what the common good is, but to put it in practice by going beyond themselves, transcending themselves and joining with others. And it is the practice itself, and this is what religions can do. Theoreticians, liberal theories, they can discuss all they want, and I'm very skeptical of the field. I think that what religions can do is precisely practice it, practice the common good, and this is what transcendence means: transcend the individual self. And this was what already Tocqueville saw. This was the role of religion, to transcend the self-interest well understood, the fact that individuals, by somehow accepting some transcendence from the self, are open to enter with others to do something for the common good. And I think that, yes, anything that helps us to transcend what is our autonomous selves, and to remind us that we live in communities, and without community we cannot be autonomous. The autonomous is a relative thing that only happens in relations with others. And so this is the task. The cognitive task is to help us understand our relationality, that we are relational beings and we need to live in community. And then the task is how to do it at all levels. But we know how difficult it is, even the common good of the nation, in the national interest. If we cannot do it at the level of the nation state, how can we do it at the level of the global human community, when every national self-interest basically is paramount? And this is why I really, really think that unless we are able to work towards a global civil society, a dynamic which is different from the dynamic of the international system, the Westphalian system of autonomous states, and the Davos system of global capitalism, then we won't be able to even address what our common challenges are. If we identify them as common challenges, we can work together to address them commonly, and then the common good will come out of this practice.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the question, for the response from Professor Casanova. We have still some time if you would like to ask a question, one further question.
Vida is asking.
Okay, please.
No, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, still unmute. Could you? Okay, yes.
Okay, now. Yes.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Hello to everyone. Yes, I have a question.
Where are you?
I am in Rome. I live in Rome, but okay. I am Albanian.
Okay, good.
I have a question about the strength of the religion in time of COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think, Professor Casanova, that this period of time was good, I would say perfect, for all religions worldwide? Because we all had one feeling, one common feeling. The fear to die, fear for death. And I think all of us were kind of obliged to be more spiritual, because the death was really close to us, to our life. So do you think that this time was good for religion? Because it brought people closer to religion. It was a kind of to be obliged within our houses to think of God, the presence of God, the hand of God.
This, I don't know. I mean, I can think of, yes, cases in which very clearly people felt those are liminal existential moments in which people perhaps are open to transcendence. But if it's only in those liminal moments when fear is there, it's not a very good source. If fear is all that leads us to transcendence, then obviously when fear disappears, this also the need will disappear. So I'm not sure whether this is a positive development. I think that what makes us evident also is more the need for solidarity, the fact that we were depending so much on the essential workers, and especially on women. Again, women that were both the essential workers, but also the now that had to have the extra work at home because as mothers, as wives, and so those are also important experiences. The question is, what do we learn out of these experiences and whether they transform us or not? I'm not sure, and this I don't have really any evidence one way or another. So yes, those are invitations to reflect on those issues, but there is no guarantee that the fear of death itself will lead us to, once the fear disappears, that will have transformed us.
Thank you.
But this I will let my fellow Jesuit brothers that have a better relation, perhaps they can answer better than I do. Yeah, Father McClone even yes.
Yeah, among us, yeah, Father Hornbaum, but of course another Jesuit father, Father Jean-Louis Ska, is among us, and I also greet him. And also Professor Grace Davy is with us, listening to us. And
hello, Grace. Nice to. I don't see you, but I'm glad that you are listening to us.
If anyone would like to join with a question or comment, you are welcome. And otherwise,
if I may, I would add information. Of course, the problem of the common God is difficult to deal with. You can consider the fact that an Italian bishop, Monsignor Amato, has worked a lot on the idea of common goods, plural. And I suppose that Pope Francis has accepted this kind of perspective, because it is difficult to have just one common good if you consider the cultures, if you consider the regions, and so on. Therefore, the proposal of common goods can be easier and can favor the interculturalism, interreligionism, and so on.
Yes, I fully agree. That's why we need to pluralize everything, even universalism. There is not one universalism. Precisely, every universalism is particular, and it's always multiple universalisms that have to somehow basically communicate with one another. And the same thing with the common good. They are common goods. The question is whether they're only common goods in the, if you wish, material sense of the term, or also the common goods that transcend us. And of course, only at the end of times, the eschaton, there will be a common singular good. But until then, of course, we'll have struggling common goods, and they will have to be reconciled. The recognition of the other is the fundamental task. To recognize the other and to recognize the common good of the other, and then to work together to transcend our common good and their common good into one common good, and so on. So yes, it is an ending process of reconciliations and recognitions. That's what we need. Yes, yes, yes.
Among three Jesuit fathers, Father Gerard McClellan would like to talk. Please, floor is yours.
Terrific. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Terrific. First of all, thank you so much, Jose. Every time I'm with you, I learn something, and that's a humble statement from a Jesuit.
Well, the same with you, Gerard.
There's so many questions I have. The first is the definitional nature of the human person. I love you encouraging us to go beyond even how we view the individual to viewing us as human beings, as the human person. I think it gets at what several of us at the Berkeley Center have been talking about in regards to a more relational ontology of who we are as human beings and as a human person. And I think that's fundamental, I think, going forward. I'm wondering how that might sort of bridge some of these huge gaps that we're seeing. And secondarily, the other question I have is, as we look at common good, as a researcher in psychology, as someone who's vehement advocate for child welfare and for violence to cease against women and children, and what we're seeing in the post-pandemic reality, I wonder if we ought not to be looking at the integration now of more scientific research that points to aspects of common goods, in the sense of I'm looking at the Gallup research on well-being, where they identify 5 key dimensions. It's, they have over 2.5 million participants in the science of this, and it comes, to essentially one of the key 5th dimensions of well-being is your participation in communal welfare and feeling as though your contribution is meaningful. And that sort of then gets back to the definition of the human person. I'm wondering, with all of this, final point, what's the practical thing that you would want us to do? If there were 1 or 2 different causes or 1 or 2 different initiatives that you really see as fundamental to moving this viewpoint, which I so value your insights, Jose, as you know, but I'm a pragmatist. I'm a scientist. I want to know the data, and I want to have concrete outcomes. Tell me what we ought to. Where's the ought in this? What's next?
Right. Well, a few points. I think what is sacred in us is what we have in common, not what distinguishes each of us, but what we share as human persons. This is what is sacred. And already Durkheim, the great sociologist of the sacred, and that developed the notion of the cult of the individual as the religion of modernity. There are 2 types of individualism. Egoistic individualism, in which basically it is whatever my ego makes me different and superior to others, versus precisely the common individualism that we share as human persons. And this was happened in the midst of the Dreyfus affair in France, where he wrote the individualism and the intellectuals, where intellectuals were being accused for their individualism. And he says, well, yes, we have to defend the true individualism, the one that precisely makes us all equal, not the one that basically makes us different, egoists, etc. So this is one aspect. The second, yes, I'm a scientist, but I'm skeptical of social science also. I wouldn't, that social science can be used for any purpose you want. And I put very little the emphasis on the scientific aspect of sociology. For me, sociology is a theory of the present with practical intention that help us to act, but cannot tell us what to do. What we ought to do will be decided by each of us. Science cannot basically give you, well, these are the options, these are what we have. But what moves us in which direction, the notion that science can tell us what to do, will not. Science cannot tell us what to do. And so ultimately, yeah, it's a call to action, but some people are going to respond in the opposite direction. As you know, if it comes from science, then I'm going to act in the opposite direction. So I'm not, unfortunately, I don't believe in science. Of course, I believe in critical scientific research. And I believe that it should be critical and it could be replicable, and that basically, yes. But ultimately, what to do and how to do it, we'll have to develop it. How to do it, of course, once we know what to do, perhaps science can help us in this. But so we have to start with ourselves, with our communities, and then depending upon which level, obviously, universities have a different function than, let's say, intellectuals. My function that I see is different from other functions, let's say, of scientists. I don't talk to sociologists anymore. I don't talk. I talk to general publics, because don't believe in self-referential science that basically repeats itself. So I don't want to be a skeptic vis-a-vis your belief in science, but I will be careful that, unfortunately, it will not save us from it. We'll have to still make the decision. This will be a moral decision, not a scientific cognitive one.
Thank you so much. We have time for the very last question. And if not, I would like to also, it's not a question, but since, especially in the International and the Center for Sociology of Religion, there are young scholars and doctoral students, especially this question is for them, and your suggestion for further research in the field of sociology of religion in the COVID-19 era. That will be my question. But if anyone would like to, ask a very short question or a very short comment, you are also very welcome.
While you think of your questions, let me add that I was the first student to have the privilege to be a guest at ICSOR. So I was there before you, and so I joined you in congratulating you to do research. And just follow your inner self. Science is always autobiographical. So you'll do best if you follow what is basically the questions that move you, and you use your own background and interest to go in depth in it. So, and again, it will come. You just have to work at it, but follow the questions from your own background. This will be the best opening as to what it is that you will be interested in doing research.
Thank you so much. Professor Cipriani, would you like to, say the last word before we close this lovely session? We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Cenap and Professor Casanova. I have to complete the biography of Professor Casanova, saying that during 2017, he was the Kluge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the North at the United States Library of Congress, John Kluge Center. And recently, José was awarded the Theology Prize from the Salzburger Hochschulwochen in recognition of his lifelong achievement in the field of theology, not of sociology, but I can say of sociology too, because I do not distinguish between this kind of sciences, especially in the case of sociology of religion. Of course, the audience today has been not so large, but I appreciate the quality of interventions and, of course, the quality of this dialogue. I congratulated Cenap 2 hours ago because the questions were very good and well organized, and we have a kind of official lecture about the religions in times of COVID-19. We will put this recording on the YouTube channel, and we will have more and more participants than this afternoon. I have to conclude saying that Professor Casanova is at home in the ICSOR Center because he is the president of the scientific committee. Therefore, he is the owner of the house. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody. I seen Vera, Valentina, Naran, Gerardo, Grace, David, Dagmar, Antonio Camorrino, Antonio Albanese, and finally, Cenap and José. Thank you so much. Bye.
Grazie mille, Roberto.
Ciao,
Grazie
ciao,
mille,
ciao,
Cenap.
ciao,
Thank
ciao.
you. Thank
Ciao.
you, Professor